Hi, and welcome to our presentation about the foundation of good nutrition through whole foods. To begin today, we wanted to read a quote from Hippocrates from 431 BC. He said, "Let your food be your medicine, and your medicine be your food." We all know that Hippocrates is considered to be the father of modern medicine. And even though he said this about 2,500 years ago, I think he was really ahead of his time. We often hear the phrase, "it's all about balance," or "we have to have a balanced lifestyle, a balanced diet." But this often leaves us feeling like we're on a tightrope as well, trying to find our way through the chaos of conflicting counsel or conflicting research. And we often do wonder what really is a balanced diet, what really is a balanced lifestyle. And it can cause a lot of stress trying to figure out how to keep that balance. This brings us to the point of diets. We just want to stress here that we're not advocating a certain diet. And in fact, most diets are something like a box that we put ourselves in. We limit ourselves in what we can eat, thinking that that's the only way that we can achieve health, whether it's the South Beach diet or the Atkins diet or the raw vegan diet. They all have this prescribed regimen of foods that we should eat and foods that we shouldn't eat. This also leads to binging because once we get off our diet, we are so excited to reward ourselves and to go back to our favorite foods. But in this presentation and in the further presentations, we really want to show a lifestyle where you can understand what your body needs and you can see how to give it those nutrients which are necessary, and how you can also do this with joy and without feeling limited and without feeling like you're trying to balance on a tightrope. So to begin with, we have the main nutrients, the energy sources of food. Those are our carbohydrates, our proteins, and our fats. Those are also called macronutrients. You've probably heard of these. This is where our bodies get our calories. Carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram. Proteins also have 4 calories per gram, but fats have 9.5 calories per gram. This is going to be important when we deal with menu planning and how to put a meal together. Because when we look at a balanced diet and getting the right amount of nutrients, we need to remember that they have different amounts of calories in each of these elements. And just a fun fact here at the bottom, 1 calorie, as we know it, it's actually called a kilocalorie in science, but 1 calorie is the energy that it takes to heat 1 liter of water by 1 degree Celsius. And when you're working out, it takes about 10 minutes to burn off 100 calories. Along with the macronutrients, we also have micronutrients, which are our vitamins and our minerals. Vitamins are further broken down into fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. The fat-soluble vitamins are the A, D, E, and K, whereas the water-soluble are the B and C vitamins. Vitamin A is important for eye health, we know. Vitamin D for bone health, but there are many uses for D in our bodies. Vitamin E is a powerful antioxidant and protectant. Vitamin K is important for blood clotting. These fat-soluble vitamins must be eaten with fat, otherwise they will pass right out of the body and not be absorbed. They also can be stored in the body though. That's in contrast to the B and C vitamins, which are water-soluble. They cannot be stored in the body nearly as long, so they pass through the system a lot faster and must be eaten more frequently. Some common minerals, we just named a few here, are zinc, iron, magnesium, calcium. Zinc is important for immune health. Iron we know of for healthy blood. Magnesium, one important use for magnesium is with muscle spasms and good healthy muscle contraction. Calcium is also important for our muscles as well as for our bones and our teeth. There are several schools of thought as far as the ratios of the calories that we eat, and how many carbohydrates, proteins, and fats we should consume. This is one of the most generally recognized ratios, which says that we should eat roughly 50 to 60% of our calories as carbohydrates. We have to be sure to differentiate calories from the weight or the volume that we eat. As I mentioned earlier, the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats have different amounts of calories per gram, so we have to keep that in mind. So along with the 50 to 60% of carbohydrates, protein should be around 10 to 15% and fat around 25 to 30%. And in the little box here, it shows a sample 2,000 calorie diet where you can see the difference between calories and weight. In a 2,000 calorie diet, that would be around 1,000 to 1,200 calories of carbohydrates, which is about 250 to 300 grams. Protein about 200 to 300 calories, fat about 500 to 600 calories. But you can see that the gram difference is substantial because fat has 9.5 calories versus 4 calories per gram. There are two other elements in our food. Those are the phytonutrients and fiber. These are both items which are just coming into the scientific foreground right now. Phytonutrients are simply plant nutrients. They can be antioxidants. They can maintain cardiovascular health. They can regulate hormones. There are thousands of phytonutrients out there. We've heard that we should eat the rainbow, and that is very true. The more color in a food, the more phytonutrients, generally speaking. That is, if it's a natural food, of course. One very important food group are the berries. We've got this picture of these lovely blackberries. They are packed full of phytonutrients and antioxidant properties. This is a very interesting field of research. If you want to do a little bit more research, you can just do a search online and you'll come up with a lot of hits for phytonutrients. Fiber is also a very important element in our foods. It's cleansing. It moves the food out of our system and keeps our digestive system clean. Soluble fiber is also able to bind to certain toxins and carry those out of our body. And fiber is also a haven for intestinal flora or intestinal bacteria. That may sound a little bit gross to begin with, but we just have to remember that the bacteria within our guts are necessary for our health. They are our friends. And one fun fact here is that 3 to 5 pounds of bacteria live in each and every one of our guts. And we need to remember that these are our friends, and the fiber provides a habitat for those friends. And in fact, I think of fiber as being our scrubbing bubbles. Here's another quote we wanted to share with you. Health is the greatest gift. To keep the body in good health is a duty. So how do we maintain good nutrition? One important aspect is to have whole foods. In our day and age, there's a lot of isolation of certain elements, and then we try to put them all back together in the perfect food. But one interesting point about foods in their natural state is they naturally have the elements which help the body to digest that food. There's a perfect combination, if you will, within the natural whole food. And this gets destroyed if we try to isolate it. There's a parable that I've heard about a farmer who wanted to get a perfect crop. So he went to God and he said, God, I want a really good crop this year. Can I please control the weather? So God said, okay, you can do that. And the farmer planned out the perfect schedule for the rain. He planted the seed at the correct time. He had the sun shining on the right days. But at the end of the year, he still didn't have a good harvest. And so he went back to God and he said, God, why didn't it work out? And God said to him, well, you forgot the wind. And I think this is a really important parable for us today, also relating to nutrition. We often do this. We try to make the perfect diet, and we miss some very important elements. But if we would just stick to whole foods as they are in nature, we would have the elements that are needed, and we wouldn't be missing anything. Some important aspects to this are minimal preparation, that is, eating things as close to the source as possible with as little preparation and as few middle steps as possible. One element of this is steaming versus boiling. We often have been taught to boil fruits and veggies, but often when we do this, we throw away the water, and in that water is a lot of the nutrients. So if we do end up boiling a fruit or a vegetable, we really should try to use that water, whether it's as a sauce, as a gravy, as a soup, as a broth, just some way to keep that nutrition. Another way around this would be to steam your fruit or your veggie by just using a little bit of water, and then that nutrition is still there in the food itself. Another aspect is to try not to fry. One aspect or one good way to cook your food is to try to steam it first, get it most of the way prepared, and then just add the oil at the very end. That works especially well for vegetables. And another aspect is to not have leftovers. Obviously, we all work in a busy society nowadays, and it may be that we have to prepare our food the day before, and we may have limited kitchen use, we may have a short lunch break. So obviously we have to be practical. But the point here is to remember that every time that you warm up a leftover, you are providing a breeding ground for bacteria at one side, and you're also losing nutrition. So we just need to keep that in mind when we're dealing with leftovers, that we really try to keep leftovers to a minimum and eat as fresh as possible. Along with this is the term farm to table. You guys have probably all heard of this term before. And that's just the same principle as above, trying to minimize the processing. And remembering that every time that we freeze something or can it or cook it, we are losing some of the nutrition. Another aspect in this is transport and storage. Nowadays, in our globalized society, we often have foods which have been stored for days, weeks, maybe even months. Maybe that even came from overseas. And the point here is just to try to eat as local as possible and as fresh as possible. And we definitely want to avoid preservatives when at all possible. Another interesting point of research is the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. I'd recommend that you do a search online for these. Basically what that is the researchers got together and they studied the pesticide and chemical residue on foods. And they made a listing of the 15 most clean and the dirtiest dozen. Basically the purpose of this is for those of us who are on a tight budget and who perhaps can't eat organic all the time. These two lists show which foods to make a priority to eat organic and which foods are lower on the priority list as far as eating organic. One main principle here is if you are peeling it or if the food itself is not so susceptible to pests, then those are usually going to be on the clean list. Some examples of the dirty dozen would be things like tomatoes and peaches and apples and strawberries, these fruits and veggies with a really thin skin where the pests can can burrow in very quickly, can eat that easily. And the other point is that we eat the skin on those foods. Whereas citrus and bananas and pineapples, for example, those are going to be more on the clean list because we don't eat the peel, and many of those plants themselves are not as susceptible to pests. The final point on this slide is having variety but also simplicity. As we talked earlier, every food has its own recipe of nutrition, and we would need to get the whole smorgasbord, if you will. We need the variety of all those fruits and veggies, but we also need simplicity because our body can't handle those all in one sitting. So it's better to take a few of those foods and eat them in one meal, and then in the next meal take a few other foods and get your variety in that way instead of all in one meal. We want to talk for a moment about a plant-based lifestyle. Plant-based and vegan are two terms that are used pretty much interchangeably in our day and age, but I would say that there's a slight difference. Having a plant-based lifestyle is usually more for health reasons, whereas a vegan lifestyle is more for ethical reasons. A plant-based lifestyle has a lot of effects on our health. It affects obesity, cancers, autoimmune disease, diabetes 1 and 2. It can raise good cholesterol and lower bad cholesterol. It can help heart disease, blood pressure, and inflammation, just to name a few. And then this graph here shows the lactose intolerance all over the world. And you can see there are some dark bands with high populations of lactose intolerance. What this illustrates simply is that we as humans are not made to digest lactose. We have those enzymes to digest lactose when we're babies because we are drinking milk from our mothers. But once we're weaned and are growing up, we lose that ability to make those enzymes, and we often are no longer able to digest lactose. And this just illustrates, again, the point that milk products were made for babies, and in the case of dairy, it's made for baby cows. And we as humans, especially as adults, don't have the ability to digest those elements, that lactose as well. The other point we want to mention about a plant-based diet is the environmental effect that it has on the earth. You can see here in this graphic, it's very well illustrated. These are soccer fields, and the red line going horizontally across is the line which marks the arable land available to each person. So basically, if we were to take all of the farmland on Earth and divide it by the population of Earth, we would get this line. So above the line is what's allotted to each person if we use this calculation. And on the left-hand side, we can see that if you don't eat any meat, you're still under that line, so you're still on your own property. With 90 grams of meat per day, you're already kind of eating into somebody else's property. And with 381 grams of meat per day, which is about 3/4 of a pound, you're eating more than twice the space allotted to one person. I think that this is just a very interesting and very illustrative chart which shows the environmental effects of eating meat, and dairy also can fall into this category because it also takes more land space than pure vegetables and fruit. We want to talk about a few other key points of good nutrition. First of all, we talked about unprocessed foods. One little fact from recent studies is that about 60% of the American diet is now processed food, which is pretty alarming if you think about it. And here on the right-hand side, we have a timeline of sugar consumption in America. dating from 1820 to 2000, and from about 0 pounds up to 120 pounds per year per person. You can see that that's climbed quite a bit since the 1820s. This is definitely one area where we could use a lot more moderation and really cut back on that, especially when we think of the diabetes rates and also the amount of sugary drinks that we consume. We all know that they're unhealthy. I think that's a point without contention. And this just puts it into a nice graph for us. Another point is gluten. And here I just want to simply mention that the point that we talked about earlier really applies to gluten. We talked about how in nature each food has within itself the elements needed for good digestion of that food. And with gluten we can see that exact point as well. Wheat has been eaten for thousands of years without problem. But in the last years, there's been genetic modification as well as isolation. For example, white flour starts out as a wheat grain, and then the bran and the middlings and the good oils and germ are all taken out, and what we're left with is essentially starch, which is sugar, and gluten. And then if you make white bread out of that flour and eat that daily, your body eventually is going to say, okay, enough is enough. Pairing that along with the genetic modification as well as other unhealthy diet and lifestyle choices, for me it's really no question that there's going to be a lot of intolerance to gluten itself. But I really want to stress here that neither gluten nor carbohydrates are the bad guys, and we have to be careful not to take one element and isolate it out as a bad guy or something evil. Just like we can't take one element and isolate it out and say that that's going to be our heal-all, our cure for everything. We have to really see things in a holistic and a complete view. We need to see the entire food as it is, and we really need to go back to how it was in nature. There are a few other factors which are not directly related to food. The first is eating times, and I mention here intermittent fasting. What I mean by that is simply giving enough time in between meals. Our stomachs take about 4 hours to empty after we've eaten a good meal. But if we eat something in between meals, for example a snack, then that whole process has to start over again, and then we need another 4 hours before our stomach empties. Our stomach actually needs time to rest as well. So what we generally say is 5 to 6 hours between meals is good. And the other point I want to mention here is to eat earlier in the day. Why I say that as opposed to some of those other regimens out there that recommend eating later in the day, the benefit of eating earlier in the day is that it helps with your sleep as well. If you go to bed with a full stomach, then your stomach is still working and still churning, and you're not able to sleep as well, and your digestive system is not getting the rest that it needs. So for that reason, I really recommend maybe a breakfast, a good breakfast in the morning and a good lunch, maybe even a little bit later lunch, and then very light, if anything at all, in the evening. And what goes along with this is sleep, getting good quantity and good quality of sleep. Stress is another factor. This is the fight or flight response. And what happens when our bodies go into fight or flight response? Our bodies shut down the digestive system. The opposite of a stress response is the relaxed state, which is termed the rest and digest stage. And that is the time when our bodies are ready to eat and ready to digest. So when we're in a stressful situation, obviously we need to learn how to manage stress correctly. This is first and foremost. But also we do naturally just have those more stressful days. And if we feel like we're in stress, then one helpful tip here is to simply not eat as much. Eat very light, just enough to give you the energy to get by, and then wait until that stress has passed. Many of you might have experienced when you're in a stressful situation and you go ahead and eat that big meal that it feels like you have a brick in your stomach. And this is why. It's because the stress is causing all the cortisol and the adrenaline to flow, and this shuts down the digestive system until that stress has passed. Another very important point is to drink enough water and to stay hydrated. A good rule of thumb is about half of your body weight in ounces per day. Some people, like myself, I prefer to simply say, okay, I need about 2 liters of water per day. Some people it's about 3 liters. So it's good to calculate it once according to your body weight and then use that as a guideline. And if you need to take a water bottle with you everywhere you go, that's a great idea. But just stay hydrated because it is so critical for digestion and for overall health. Exercise is also critical. It does relieve stress. It gets all your muscles working, which does help the digestion. It also prepares you for better sleep. It raises and releases endorphins, which makes you happier and gets rid of depression. So overall exercise, if there's one thing here that is most important, I would say exercise is at the top of the list here. And along with that is joy. This is the overarching principle, and it goes in direct contrast to the word that we said at the beginning, which was diet and feeling like you're having to be on a tightrope. The most important thing of all in any lifestyle change is to have happiness and joy. It will free the mind and free the body as well. So to finish our presentation, we just want to read one last quote. "Do not worry about what you will eat or drink. Is not life more than food? A cheerful heart is good medicine." And here are just a few resources if you would like some more research material. Thanks very much for listening. We hope it was helpful.